I'm very pleased to welcome to Concordia Dr. Acha Leke, Partner and Chairman Africa at McKinsey & Company, Aubrey Hruby, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, and Funlola Otukoya, Concordia's Africa Advisor and Investor at McKnight Foundation. Funlola, over to you.
Hi, Aubrey. Hi, Acha. How are you guys?
Excellent.
So the last time I saw both of you, it was a beautiful, balmy night in South Africa, and the world was much different, remarkably different. So I'm curious, now that we're in a sort of new paradigm, what does a post-COVID Africa look like for you guys?
I mean, for me, it's digitization is the biggest kind of force coming out of COVID. You're seeing the COVID experience accelerate the digitization trend that we were already seeing. And that's globally, but it's transformative in African markets, especially around efforts on governments to digitize. So much of government interaction with citizens was still paper oriented or queuing oriented. And so I'm seeing a lot of efforts around digitization of government services, and not just in the outperforming countries like Rwanda, but even in Nigeria, there are a lot of efforts to adopt digital solutions that I think can actually enhance productivity, especially in the cities. We know that Africans have, from Lagos to Nairobi to Kinshasa, have spent a lot of time in traffic, commuting, and maybe some of the work patterns that have changed as a result of COVID will stick, and you get that extra productivity of not losing 2 hours a day commuting.
Yeah, I mean, the first reaction I had was, first, what does a COVID Africa look like for me, right? Sitting in Johannesburg and, not having travel. I didn't travel for about 6 months, it's kind of the last time I spent that much time at home. But in many ways, and that was the reality for many of us, right? Lockdowns, trying to make sure we stay safe and healthy. And in the midst of that, there are also some opportunities that is created, right? So if I think of going forward, I'll actually start where you ended, Aubrey, which is a fundamental change in many ways in how we live and operate, right? I think too many of us live the life of being on the plane all the time, all over the place, and we realize, it's not something you have to do, right? And so a fundamental change in how we operate and live our lives. I think there's at least some opportunities that the crisis has created, right? So I think Aubrey spoke about digitization. That's by far, I think, the biggest opportunity, right? The digital transformations we saw companies and countries do in 2 to 3 years, we've seen it happen in 2 to 3 months on the continent, right? And so a continuation of that trend, but also, a realization that a number of people have been really affected by this. And what do we do as we think about this whole rebuild better, building back better? What do we need to do as a continent to rebuild our economies in a way that is more resilient and more equitable? And a lot of the work we're doing as McKinsey with governments is exactly that, is to say, if we're going to rebuild now, how do we make sure we include sort of elements of the green economy in our rebuild already? Thinking about it now, how do we build better? So I think hopefully some of these will come out. And the final thing I would say is, in the midst of all of this, I think, one of my big lessons is how blessed many of us listening here are, and just recognizing that and figuring if we're this blessed, what is our role in helping to, lift others and help each other equally blessed as we are.
Yeah, I ask about post-COVID Africa because I'm so ready for a post-COVID world. We've been in a sort of our lockdown for almost a year, and I'm thinking about what's giving me hope for a post-COVID Africa, where you're seeing some successful trials in the U.S. and really globally around viable COVID vaccines. And I'm wondering, sort of in the U.S., you saw a successful, or I think successful, U.S. election in which there might be some changes for how the U.S. looks at African policy and what that could mean for African businesses on the continent and doing business globally. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I mean, certainly this new administration will be different than the past 4 years. There will be a difference in tone. And it's certainly, when Biden was elected, I feel like the world exhaled, and people really are welcoming what they anticipate is a return of normalcy, that they don't have to wake up and see what's most recent on Twitter and what, you know, new thing is come out of left field today kind of attitude. And it's no doubt that this new administration will be more multilateral in its orientation and really choose to re-engage in multilateral fora. And that is very important for Africa, because African countries constitute the greatest number of votes in the WTO and in the UN, in the WHO, and are well represented in these international agencies. So there will be kind of a bias towards international engagement and multilateralism that we didn't see over the last 4 years. On the same point, though, you know, there's been a lot of continuity in Africa policy. Trump actually kept all of Obama's programs, whether it was the Young African Leaders Program or Power Africa. They were kept because Africa policy in Washington has been very, very bipartisan historically, and every president has kind of kept some continuity with the last. So I do see on programs probably some continuity, but in tone and engagement willingness, a much different administration.
I mean, the one thing I would say to that, and I'll let you know, Aubrey's the expert when it comes to sort of the US-Africa linkages, right? But when I just take from an Africa perspective, I think regardless of where we come out, I think what the crisis has helped us do is understand the value of having a strong African voice, right? Mm-hmm. And a unified African voice. And I know Rita was on before talking about the medical supplies platform, right? And the genesis for that was really the realization at the time when all countries were looking for ventilators, were looking for test kits, and many African countries were just being squeezed out of the market, right? Because, you know, would find even if you wanted to buy it, you know, people would just pay more and just get it. And it's only when under President Ramaphosa's leadership we came together as a continent and said, look, you know, with the 1.2 billion people, this is how many, you know, test kits we need. This is how many other time ventilators we need. This is, and let's go negotiate at that level with, you know, China or with the UK or with some other of our partners. Then we really saw things opening up for us, right? So I think part of what we've learned and coming out of the crisis, and you can see what, you know, Africa CDC has done and how the African Union has really stepped up to help us really address the crisis at a Pan-African level. We've seen the value of that, and so I'm hoping that that momentum will continue. And so whatever discussion we're having, you know, with the US, with any other partners, be that, we would definitely continue to understand the value of doing that, having one unified voice as a continent.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's a really big development in terms of, you know, most African countries are very small, and that fragmentation is a disadvantage for attracting investment, but also as a buying power. And then you become a price taker and you can't really determine the prices. And, you know, I think it's not just in health. If you look at the Smart Africa initiative on buying broadband in bulk, I think that mentality and that organization and hopefully innovation out of the Secretariat of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, those things all go hand in hand. And you really then can actually capture the value of having a large market if there's collective buying and coordination on those issues.
I mean, I'm sorry, I know we're sort of harping on this, but, you know, if just harmonization of regulations, we're all excited about the vaccines that are being discovered and being tested. That's amazing, right? The question is, you know, how do you make sure we get them? We get them on the continent. There's a pricing component. How do we pay for them? And we're working with Africa CDC and different partners on this. But the big question is, how do they get then registered in countries if we need every single country to go through its regulations to register it, right? Is there a way to do that at a Pan-African level so that we speed up the process? So those are some of the practical issues that we're dealing with on the continent and hopefully going to resolve in the next few months.
Yeah, it's so funny. I was about to go to the African continent free trade agreement, but now I think it's better time as any, as you brought it up a lot, Acha, to talk about sort of logistics on the continent and if there's a vaccine or you know, business opportunities that sort of excite you. What are the risks or what are the opportunities that you see around logistics?
Well, I mean, you know, if you just focus on the vaccine for now, because you'll have to, you know, distribute them, right? So first, you know, we spend a lot of time thinking through what is our strategy. As a continent, should we be aiming to vaccinate 20% of the population, 40, 60, 80, right? We went back and forth a lot. I think where Africa CDC has come out and the presidents have endorsed it as our goal is to vaccinate 60% of the population, right? That's going to cost somewhere between 10 to 12 billion dollars. And that's what it's going to cost. So now the question is, where is the money going to come from? So the COVAX facility, you probably know, has some money, right? And we're going to build on that. But that's typically for sort of the first 20%, right? And then the World Bank has announced a facility, so we're working with Dr. Pata and his team as well, to figure out how much of that is going to go to Africa. But there'll be a gap, right? And so now Afreximbank is stepping up to see what can they do to close that gap. But that's just to purchase the vaccines, right? Then to your point on logistics, you need them to be delivered in country, and you need them to be now distributed in country, right? And so that's part of the work. And we're learning a lot from the medical supplies platform, because they've had to do this with test kits, they've had to do this with PPE, right? So we're learning a lot from their experience to say, do we use that mechanism to get these vaccines into country? And then there's the big question around, who then gets vaccinated first, right? Of course, the healthcare workers and the frontline workers and people with comorbidities and the elderly who probably will take priority, right? But what is the process to do it in a context where we've never done vaccination at this scale for this size population and this age of population in the past? So there's a lot that we need to learn, right? And all of that is things that literally we are helping out with. But Africa CDC is really taking the lead on this.
But at the same time, those same problems exist in the U.S. market. Those same problems of like how this is going to be distributed. If you look at just even the challenges here on testing in D.C., I mean, it's gotten better, but at the beginning, it was hard to get a test. It was, these logistical problems, I think, exist in almost all markets. But one of the, important things I think we have to zoom in on around Africa and the vaccines is cold storage, right? And at least the Moderna one is regular freezer temperatures rather than extreme, like special freezer temperatures, which is, the Pfizer case. And so the cold storage supply chains, I think, are going to become very, very critical in this vaccine process.
So I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit towards sort of African global champions and regional champions. I've had many conversations about the Paystack acquisition and sort of what that means for the African fintech ecosystem, the African tech ecosystem. I'm curious as to your thoughts, because I think I may be a little bit contrarian on this one.
I'm curious as to your thought.
No, yeah, absolutely. And Fun, we want to hear your view. I mean, listen, I'm very active in the venture space, venture ecosystem, particularly around Nigeria. And what has been holding back, I would say, additional money from coming in, even though we've seen a kind of 50% year-on-year increase every year of the venture flows. You see some numbers of it surpassing 2 billion last year. And I must say, even during COVID, it's shown really strong resilience. The number of companies, African companies, that raised over $1 million this year in 2020 is higher already in November than it was for total last year. So we're seeing an increase or at least a steady state in terms of venture flowing into the region. But the thing that's held it back is a lack of exits. And we need data on exits to show and to prove, A, that investors can get their money back, but to also have comparables when it comes to valuations. And the lack of exits, I know personally, has held back additional money. I've talked to a lot of potential venture investors that think Africa is too early because of the lack of exits. So the Stripe exit for Paystack is valuable. We need lots more of those in order to really show that it's possible and that the ecosystem's maturing. And secondly, in addition to the exits piece, the importance of that exit is that it adds visibility. People cannot invest in things they cannot see. And so if you're sitting in Silicon Valley or Hong Kong or Moscow and you're a venture investor and you're trying to understand the landscape, all of a sudden you open the Wall Street Journal or you look at TechCrunch and it's this acquisition is being written about. All of a sudden you're like, Nigerian fintech, interesting. And it's that visibility that drives a lot of interest. So I think it's relevant in those two areas.
I couldn't agree more. I think, we need these kind of examples in Africa, right? And it's a great success story. And I'll just point the question, what's it going to take to have more of them, right? Because, one is interesting, but if that's the only one we have in the next 5 years, people will say it's the exception, right? You want this to be sort of the rule, right? And we've seen a number of these, and every year we're going to see a few more. The question is, what's it going to take? So part of what I think we need to do is celebrating it, but I think a lot of people need to just reflect on what did they do right, to be able to exit in that way, right? and what do we then need to do to replicate? How do we get 5 pay stacks next year? And for me, that should be the question. I'm really thinking through, in addition to our celebration, it's great to celebrate, thinking through what can we learn from their experience, right? So we can go replicate this over and over.
Well, one thing for sure is the role of corporate venture, right? So corporate venture plays a big, big role in Silicon Valley, and it even does in Indian startup ecosystem. But it's at a nascent state, especially outside of South Africa. Corporate venture, structured corporate venture is still very, very early in, say, Nigeria. And so I think that if more local players, banks, and InterSwitch eventually has its own venture arm, that will allow for a lot of smaller, maybe more local exits, but it helps build that strategic exit into the company from an early stage. And that's what you saw with Stripe. They had been involved together for a long time before this exit happened. And that's very common globally with corporate venture.
But I also think one thing that we're missing, we need more of the successful African entrepreneurs to back the next generation, right? So that's part of, I think, what's also missing in terms of creating the VC industry here. I think we need more people, and we have a number who've actually been very successful, right? How do you encourage them? And hopefully this deal will show them that, it's one sort of asset class where you can come in, you can help the next generation. You can also make some good money, right? And so you can do good and do well. So hopefully this would encourage more of them to
Yeah, it's happening. Honestly, right now in Nigeria, all these guys are getting calls from like the big ogas who are like wanting into this kind of deal. And so in that sense, it is happening. The question is, are they, there needs to be a lot of education around the asset class overall and what venture investments look like. But, even like a Jim Ovia and some of the big players have been doing some early stage venture investing for some time. But I would love to see a Dangote Ventures, say in the agriculture space, or Abua Ventures in industrial. Like it's not just about the fintech world. There's also opportunities for the older generation of successful entrepreneurs to invest in the younger that fit within their supply chains. And so hopefully we'll see a lot more of that. But Fun, we want to hear what your contrarian view is.
I'm currently wondering, to your point, if the VC model on the continent works when if you're looking at an 8 to 10 year fund model and you really have to deploy capital within 3 to 4 years and look for exits sort of in the latter J curve of the fund and receive exits. Is the bench, or do we have enough liquidity on the continent to make venture attractive?
Well, on that, you remember, like early stage investors, I'm a seed investor. You don't have to hold until the end. you can exit at a later round, and that happens all the time. So you don't have to wait until the 8 years for the exit or so, right? You can exit earlier. What you need though is enough exits to understand the valuation at various stages in the company and have true comparables. So I think it still works. Does Silicon Valley venture work exactly? And does it have the right structures? Not necessarily. And I think that all the funds that have been successful in the early stage investing space, so that be like a TLCom, a Lateral, a CRE, these type of funds, they think about it differently, right? They're not necessarily looking for the unicorn. They're looking for steady companies that can meaningfully exit sometimes smaller valuations.
Yeah. So for me, the question is more around the unicorn to your question, right? Just like my friend Fred Swanica talks about, it should be unicorns, it should be camels, or whatever he calls them, right? But there's something about, this model of saying, I'm just going to look for the 1 out of 10 unicorn. I just don't think that's going to work on the continent, right? It's just too far and far in between to actually get it, right? I do think your question in my mind on the sort of exit and all that, that's the big debate in the private equity space, right? Which is, you raise a fund and yes, you invest over 3-4 years, you need to exit, you have 1 bad year. There's nothing you can do to recover that, right? There's a macro event in the country. And as such, you can see people, then you have the currency mismatch and those kinds of issues, right? And so part of what you see is people moving more towards sort of evergreen funds, right? And you see sort of the part of the Helios deal with Fairfax is a bit of that to start to add that as a part of the asset class, right? I think that's important because people are really rethinking with the PE model on the continent. That's one. And two, the second thing is, again, back to, how do you raise more money locally? right? So then you don't have that currency mismatch anymore, right? So we need a lot more of our pension funds to actually get into, get into that space and fund the ventures across the continent, as opposed to only rely on international investors.
Yeah, not just pension funds. Some of the companies that I've seen, for example, in the markets, they really need, especially during COVID, liquidity, and they need working capital. And, pension fund investors not doing that, but they definitely need it in Naira. They need that not to absorb the currency spread. And so you need players locally, whether they be merchant banks, or anyone that can take and really handle these letters of credit that are kind of drying up in some markets. So that's an area I think all of us need to think on in terms of innovation is how to get additional working capital into the space.
So I want to touch on one last thing, but we only have 5 minutes. But if you could briefly touch on this, the role of sort of distributed finance and namely Bitcoin and how it played a role in the protests in Nigeria, and sort of what does that mean for the ecosystem of crypto on the continent?
I have to admit, I don't understand enough of the space. I just learned about it last week. I had somebody sit me down on a breakfast and explain it to me. I'll hand that over to Audrey for now.
No, I think that's a very honest approach. I think very few people get the depths of crypto. I mean, most of us get blockchain, and then the next step we're like, ooh. But I can say that there's some innovation going on, and clearly there's use cases. Often what you have, though, is that you have a solution in search of a use case. And, maybe there are one or two use cases that you find every so often. In the case in the InSARS protests, when bank accounts were closed and they needed to bypass both corporate and state regulations and structures, people definitely used Bitcoin. But any currency needs to be ubiquitous and accepted all kinds of places to be of significant value from a transformative perspective. And so I definitely think it's worth a longer conversation, because there's blockchain which undergirds it, and there's so many applications of that, and it fits a lot with the digitization conversation we were having. But then there's the cryptocurrency, and those things, yes, they're related, but you can have one without the other. And so crypto's still early days, but I'm seeing a lot of folks looking into it, certainly, and innovating around wallets. It's just a matter of finding the mass use case, the same way that M-Pesa did when they introduced, or was Safaricom introduced M-Pesa.
Yeah, I'm bullish on the role of African champions and African global champions. I want to give both of you maybe 10 to 15 seconds to sort of wrap up on risk and opportunities that you see for the continent going forward. And maybe we can leave it there.
I mean, listen, African markets have proven way more resilient than people think. And Acha's done a ton of work over the years on those markets that are more diversified than dependent on resources. And the diversified markets prove even more resilient. And so I think the bounce back will be faster than people think in the region, especially with digitization unleashing productivity. So I do think we need to focus on the productivity gains and sustain those productivity gains even in a post-COVID world.
And absolutely, I think we're actually starting to see a faster bounce back, right? So we had, 6 months ago, we thought even, we as McKinsey thought, a third of jobs in Africa at risk. But the reality is, from an economic, actually from a health perspective, we've not been as affected as the rest of the world. From an economic perspective, either, right? Our countries did the right things very quickly to get into lockdowns, but they've also had to open up very quickly as well, right? Because we couldn't sustain it and manage the two. So I think what my sense, what we're going to see is a quicker rebound across the continent, which will create immense opportunities for businesses and for the public sector. So I continue to be quite bullish about the continent. The one thing I would say for businesses is, there's a term called resilience. We studied crisis over the last many years, and what we found is companies that actually win during the crisis do much better relative to the competitors post long after the crisis. So the decisions that companies make now are actually fundamental and critical to the long-term future. So my last message would be, be very thoughtful about the decisions you make now. What do you exit from? What do you get into? how much cost you take out, how do you pivot your business, because that will set you up for success for a long time ahead.
Thank you so much, Aubrey, and thank you so much, Acha.